Vielen Dank, Frau Staatsministerin. Ich hoffe, Sie können noch ein klein Weilchen hier bleiben, um mit uns gemeinsam der Keynote von Phil Howard zuzuhören. Phil Howard ist Kanadier. Er forscht und lehrt seit kurzem am Oxford Internet Institute. Er beschäftigt sich seit ganz vielen Jahren mit den Risiken und Chancen der Digitalisierung für Politik und Gesellschaft. Er hat 10 spannende Bücher geschrieben. Das jüngste heißt Pax Technica, zu Deutsch Finale Vernetzung über das Internet der Dinge. Und es ist sehr spannend. Und derzeit heißt sein Projekt Computational Propaganda. Das ist eine groß angelegte Studie, finanziert vom Europäischen Forschungsrat. Und da werden in einer Reihe von Ländern nicht nur Bots untersucht, was sie tun, sondern vor allen Dingen, wer sie einsetzt. Und das Ziel ist natürlich, Strategien dagegen zu entwickeln. Es gibt gerade erste Daten aus Deutschland und jetzt muss ich sagen, eine englischsprachige Keynote ist eine Premiere für das LPR-Forum. Wir haben eine Kurzfassung seiner Keynote in deutscher Übersetzung auf Ihre Stühle gelegt. Diese Übersetzung hat eine junge Nachwuchswissenschaftlerin aus Oxford, vom Oxford Internet Institute angefertigt. Herzlichen Dank, Lisa Maria Neudath, dafür. Das war eine wunderbare Hilfe. Ja, und für dieses Thema Disrupted Public Sphere gibt es eigentlich niemanden, der besser geeignet wäre, uns zu erklären, ob und warum Social Media die Demokratie zerstören, zumindest gefährden könnten. Herzlich willkommen, Phil Howard. The floor is yours and we are delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you to the forum organizers for the opportunity to present to you. I must address you in English, but if I may make a joke about professors, my own career choice, I will be presenting today some of the latest research we've been doing on bots and automation in Germany. And the memo that we wrote presenting this data was 4 pages, and it became 6 pages when it was translated into German. So I think the advantage of having me present to you is that I can talk to you about the research in about 30 minutes that a German professor would take 45 minutes to get through. So I hope I'm a good choice for you. This research project began essentially in 2014. I was living in Budapest, and it was a difficult summer for Budapest. And one of the things I noticed that my Hungarian friends were experiencing was a significant deluge of misinformation from Russia on many of the issues that Hungarians are wrestling with in the summer of 2014. And at the time, I thought that much of this might have been automated, computationally generated. It was certainly being targeted at people in and around Central European University, where I was teaching. And it occurred to me that if Hungary was a target for this kind of experiment with propaganda now, other larger, more established democracies might eventually become similar kinds of targets. So the research we've been doing has been funded by the European Research Council, and I'm going to talk through several examples of the kinds of phenomena we study, and then I'm going to end with some of our recent research on what happened in the US election and some of the bot activity, the fake news activity that we've been tracking in Germany. Our basic research question is fairly straightforward. What is the impact of computational propaganda on public life? Now, computational propaganda has 2 parts to it. It involves the fake news, as I believe we've heard our previous speakers refer to, the fake news and the bots. And it takes both. It takes the automation and the lies to have an effective computational propaganda campaign. If you simply tell the stories and present the misinformation and nobody sees it, there's no impact for public life. If you only have the automation, but the automation doesn't confuse people, then the political impact is minimal. So it takes both the propaganda part and the algorithms to produce these political outcomes. Now, most of the data that I'll be presenting today involves Twitter, but we could talk perhaps during the Q&A, if you like, about how this applies to Facebook. First, let me walk through several kinds of bots to give you examples of what these things look like. This is one of the accounts we recently identified in our German study. There's several things that betray it as a bot. It is tweeted thousands of times, tens of thousands of times. It began in 2016, so it's only been around for a year. What we find with these automation accounts that have heavily automated code behind them is that they're very good at spreading negative messages. They spread anger. They spread pictures that have been taken out of context. They spread stories that don't make a lot of sense, but may feed somebody's interest in conspiracies. This is an example of another kind of bot, one that was caught in the United States. There are very few rules that govern campaign communication in the United States. One of the rules is that the Political Action Committee that has the money for a politician cannot cooperate with the candidate themselves. So the candidate and the Political Action Committee are supposed to be distinct. They're not supposed to collaborate. This was a bot that was sharing budgeting information and survey results from the Political Action Committee in open over Twitter in an encrypted format, and the candidate had an algorithm that would capture the data, bring it back, and they would use it for their own strategic planning. The candidate would then trade the secrets again in open over Twitter back to the Political Action Committee. So automations and algorithms are not simply about propaganda, but they're also about other kinds of strategic political information that can have a significant impact during a campaign. Here's one of the accounts we identified during our research in Brexit. Now, this account is particularly interesting for us because Brexit was the first piece of research that we did in our lab, but it identified a set of accounts that had been previously been tweeting about Israel and Palestine. You may notice up at the top, this is Colonel Connaughton. The name he goes by is Israel Bombs Babies. And for several years, he was mostly interested, this account, was mostly interested in Israel and the status of Palestine. But then it shifted to being interested in Brexit. After we did our Brexit research, we went to look at the United States and began studying the debates, the role of automation in covering the debates between the presidential candidates. And some of the accounts moved with us. They went from being interested in Israel to being interested in Brexit to being interested in the United States and the American election. After the American election was over, you can guess, they were interested in the Italian referendum. Now they're interested in the German elections coming up. They're interested in France. There are not many of these, but there are enough to make us appreciate that there is a continuity. There are either techniques, or there's learning across groups, or there are individuals behind the organization of these accounts that have a fairly consistent vision of which international issues, which elections, which referenda are worth meddling in. So this is an example of one of the tweets. And what we found in this research on the Brexit debate was that the Leave campaign was much more aggressive than the Remain campaign with their social media communications, twice as aggressive. So they were tweeting twice as often with usually more anger, usually playing up many of the stereotypes about immigrants and race and gender that we try not to encourage in public life. But the Leave campaign was twice as aggressive with its messaging during that referendum. Now I have two slides of data that will take you into what are the analysis we did in the United States election. This is a slide from the third debate. You may remember there were 3 debates, and there are some good things and some bad things I want to talk to you about for this slide. The pro-Trump traffic is red. The blue traffic is Hillary Clinton's traffic. The black line is the neutral traffic. These are neutral tweets. We took a big scoop of data. Anybody using the American political hashtags for the election on these key days was scooped up in our analysis. And one of the nice things that this figure represents is that Twitter itself is still a platform for neutral political conversation at key moments in a political event, like an election. So on the night of the 19th, when the debate happened, the number of people who were tweeting about having enjoyed the debates or heard the arguments or contributing in some way to advancing discussion greatly outpaced the partisan, the clearly pro-Trump and the clearly pro-Hillary content. We saw this over all three debates, and then we saw it again the night of the election. So the punchline here is that social media is still very important in key moments as a platform for political conversation. One of the things we noticed, this was from the third debate, one of the things we noticed, though, in this analysis for this debate was a shift in the automation strategy. So for both Clinton and Trump had their bot armies. Some of them would have been coordinated by the campaign. A larger network would have been coordinated by supporters. Right? Sometimes these supporters call themselves patriotic programmers because they're tweeting for their nation. One of the things we notice is that at the beginning of the broadcast of a debate between major political figures, the Twitter traffic increases, right? Everybody gets online, they watch the news, and they tweet about what they're seeing. The Trump camp was between 4 and 5 times as loud, aggressive, active, it depends on which adjective you want to use, but 4 or 5 times as active as Hillary Clinton supporters. Over the course of each debate, there were 3 of them, this ratio grew to be 6 or 7 times as active. So the Trump accounts were much louder than Hillary Clinton's accounts. And there were 2 important strategic changes that we noticed. The first is that the people tweeting for Trump, using Trump hashtags, began using Hillary Clinton's hashtags. They colonized the conversation that Hillary Clinton's supporters were having about her public policy ideas. We call this colonization because the story that they took from the Trump camp to the Hillary Clinton's Democrat supporters was the story of corruption, right? Of email investigations and questions that were unanswered. There were also the stories that we know to be fake news, right? About the pedophilia ring in the pizza parlor that didn't even have a basement. There were many lies involved in these kinds of stories. So the colonization was actually a fairly aggressive move. Anybody supporting Hillary Clinton suddenly got inundated with the stories about how she's a liar, how she's crooked, she's going to jail, these kinds of things. So there's a process of colonization that can occur across political conversations. The second thing we noticed is that the bots were used very aggressively in the first debate and the second debate to declare their candidate a winner, right? To announce that their candidate had won, and both camps announced this right away. One of the interesting things that happened for the Trump bots is that they shifted by an hour and announced that Trump had won the debates before the debate was broadcast. Right. The beginning of the traffic preceded the beginning of the debate. This shift by about an hour gave the impression over the political conversations over that night's debates that Trump was well ahead. The activity for pro-Trump launched early. So we saw a process of colonization. We also saw a strategic process involved that about when to launch the campaign of information. Now, the previous slide involved the traffic, the rhythms of traffic around the debate. This chart involves the rhythms of traffic in the days leading up to the election itself. There's a similar story. The amount of neutral traffic is actually fairly low most days, except on the day of the election itself. That's the day when people share that they went to vote. They share the pride in that they voted. The neutral traffic does rise. Once again, Hillary Clinton's traffic is a fraction of what Trump's was. And one of the interesting strategic things we noticed here is that after Trump won, right, the night of the 8th, traffic dwindled off. Now, most bot activity that we've studied actually is fairly consistent. It follows a fraction of what people are tweeting. A fraction of what people are tweeting is grabbed and repurposed and pushed back out. But somebody after the election decided to stop running their bots and basically went to sleep and turned them off. Right? There is strategy behind this automation. It's not simply that people turn on accounts and program them well and let them run. They're very much part of the modern campaigning toolkit. And so I actually see this in part as a freedom of speech issue, but I also see it as an issue of managing elections. Twitter, social media communications are now part of the media conversation that deserves some public policy oversight, especially during these sensitive moments of public deliberation. Now, I've got two text slides to explain what we found in our most recent research. The US election's long gone. There's nothing we can do about that, except to go back to the data. And we decided to do a focused look at Michigan. This is a state where public opinion, right up until the last day, was very balanced. And in almost all circumstances, social media, it's very difficult for us to connect a tweet to a changing mind, a voter's mind. That's a very difficult direct connection to make. But this kind of computational propaganda becomes extremely important when races are close, when there's a fraction of a percentage difference between the people choosing among candidates. That's when this kind of propaganda can have a real impact. So Michigan was one of those states. It was a state where everything was fairly even. About half the state was Clinton, half the state was Trump. If there's going to be an effect, a negative effect for fake news, we expect that we would reasonably find it here. So again, we pulled all the Twitter traffic generated by people voters living in Michigan and tweeting about politics. That gave us some 130,000 tweets all in all, and of that oeuvre, that political content, there were about 25,000 tweets that involved sharing a story, sharing a news story of some kind. We went through and coded them all, evaluated them to see which organizations were having content shared the most, which organizations were the least. We coded them for their source. We found some originating in Russia. We found some originating amongst the fake news sites that we know in the US. And what we found, I think, surprised us. All in all, the proportion of junk news and professionally produced news was about 1-to-1. So for every story that came from a credible news organization with professional journalists, there was one clear piece of junk that was made up. It turns out we use the word fake news, a phrase fake news, but it's very difficult to operationalize that, to use fake news as a concept for identifying particular articles, because so much of this stuff we call junk is more like propaganda or commentary, masking as news, opinion pieces that are on websites that are formatted to look like the New York Times. Sources that link directly to WikiLeaks as evidence. Now, so one piece of junk to one piece of professional news. If you add in the junk news to the proportion of links to unverified WikiLeaks stories and the proportion originating with Russia Today, Sputnik, or one of the other known Russian news services, almost half the news content came from those three sources alone. In the English language media, Daily Caller, Truthfeed, Breitbart, there's a set of 4 or 5 well-known fake news sites, all easily outperformed the major news properties that we all know. So, conversation about politics was we believe, greatly shaped, certainly if it's represented over Twitter, with extremist, sensationalist, conspiratorial, commentary that's masking as news, fake news, and other forms of junk. Within the state itself, the proportion of Hillary Clinton traffic to Donald Trump traffic was the same as the national average. And then our third finding perhaps surprised us most from the US. Not only did the levels of junk news outperform the real news when you add in the Russia Today stuff and the WikiLeaks, but the proportion of professional news reached its lowest point the night of the election, the day before the election. Now, we know from political communication research that most people make up their minds about how to vote in the 3 days before an election. You can poll a population for months before the voting day, but most people decide in those last 3 days. So those are the sensitive moments when people listen to see how their friends and family are voting. And those are the moments, those are the days when understanding how news flows over social networks is very important. Moving towards the close, let me say something about what we found in our German research. So we set up the categories for what counts as junk news, and we identified several other kinds of political actors that generate content. Just as another little poke at my own career path, the amount of news, the number of links, the percentage of the links coming from experts, academics, government agencies, think tanks, universities, was around 5% altogether. So the experts were generating a tiny fraction of the content being shared in the public conversation about the election. So, to look at our German data, we did a similar scoop of data during the recent presidential election, and we did this knowing full well that it's not the most competitive of races, it's a peculiar moment, but we chose to do that 3 or 4 day chunk of time rather than take a random week. We thought that week would be an important benchmark to get us ready to study the election coming up in October. So this was very much a benchmarking study. We found 3 things. Traffic about the far-right group was surprisingly large compared to what we think their percentage of support in the popular support is. Number 2, the impact of bots was minor compared to what we expected, with highly automated accounts generating a relatively small fraction of Twitter about the election. Now, bots operate in different ways in different circumstances. There are good bots that operate on Wikipedia. And whenever the Russian government tries to edit one of the entries on Wikipedia, the bots respond and they announce. There are bots that track when the Canadian government tries to edit one of the Canadian entries on Wikipedia. So I'm not picking on Russia in this sense. Almost every government has some form of bot that watches to see if officials using a government computer attempt to edit what's ostensibly the public record of Wikipedia, and they announce. They don't correct. Sometimes bots are programmed to make corrections that are clearly political edits. But these are good examples of bots running to make Wikipedia a trustworthy operation. Facebook has bots, but they control all their bots. We actually don't know how they operate. We know that they're used to not show you everything in your Facebook feed. They don't show you everything that your friends and family generate. They select specific chunks of content to show you on Facebook. But we're unable to audit them. Facebook doesn't share data, doesn't play well with academics, and doesn't report on the activity of its bots. We know its bots also shape news content delivery, but we don't know how. So the impact of bots over Twitter was relatively minor. And then the ratio of professional news to junk news over this German sample was about 4 to 1. So for every 4 pieces of professionally produced news, there was 1 piece of junk. Now, from my point of view, I'm a glass full kind of person. I see this that in compared to the United States, this seems great. That the news consumption in Germany is significantly better than what Americans and probably Canadians are getting. My German collaborator disagrees and says that any portion is out of whack. So this may be also something we could discuss in our questions and answers together. I think it's difficult to do this research without occasionally pausing to wonder about what we should do about it. Now, we're in the second year of a 5-year project from the funded by the European Research Council. And at the moment, most of my ideas about what to do about it are personal. They're about things that we need to do as individuals, because it is very difficult to disengage from social media platforms. And even if you think you've never been on Facebook, if you've ever had a friend tag you in a photo and put that on Facebook, there is a profile about you. So it's very difficult to fully disengage from social media at the moment. I think the best option for us as citizens is to be purposeful, to be careful with how we use social media, to be aware of how the applications on our phone share information between applications. We need to use social media and be aware of how our networks are bounded. One of the worst possible outcomes of the polarization in the United States after the last election would be if all the Trump voters unfriend the Hillary Clinton voters. And if the Hillary Clinton voters unfriend the Trump voters, that will make American social networks even more bounded. And that is among the worst possible outcomes for this kind of phenomenon. So be aware of how your networks are bounded and use social media purposefully, and then become an information activist. I'm increasingly convinced that being aware of information and media policy is crucial because it is one of the domains of policy that affects all others. It will be very difficult to make any progress on climate change, on disease vectors and public health, on immigration, on a range of things, if information policy is bungled or not well crafted. So becoming an information activist is one of the safest paths to improving the quality of our deliberation online. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. And I have a colleague who will help me if you'd like to ask your questions in German. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. This was quite interesting and very provocative. Are there questions? Lisa Maria is helping with translation. Yes, here.
So Howard, thank you very much for the interesting talk. The first question is, of course, how do you really identify a bot from a normal account? And the second is Twitter really so important for Germany?
Two excellent questions. So, by hand.
Excuse me, this was Professor Zweig. She is a computer scientist from the University of Kaiserslautern, and she was also a speaker of previous conferences
Wonderful.
here. So she's well known.
Then forgive me for my professor jokes. I'm sorry. By hand, as you probably know, the way to identify them is to see some serious divergence in the sort of the rhythm of tweeting. An account that was only begun a few months ago and has tweeted 100,000 times, or an account that only ever does strange pictures, or only ever tweets about soccer, and then suddenly is interested in the Philippines. Those kinds of illogical jumps. Bots tend to follow each other. They tend to follow journalists. They tend to follow politicians. They have been used as tools for attack for politicians. In fact, over several countries, but not just Germany, bots have been used to attack female journalists and female politicians and prominent female feminist intellectuals. So sometimes you can tell by their dirty words and the yelling and the all caps, the content. For the machine learning, it's best to detect bots with a set of things that includes looking for content that comes from one account and then 1,000 other accounts at the same second, or looking for accounts that come from a particular platform. So many of us who use Twitter tweet from the platform itself. There are also some known bot providers that launch these Twitter attacks. So there's a range of different ways that you can detect bots. And I should say it's getting harder and harder because the best bots are quite sophisticated. They're groomed by people who manage multiple accounts at once. A few simple typos makes an account look more human and throws off our machine learning algorithms for identifying them. So it is getting harder and harder to identify bots. And forgive me, what was the second part of your question?
How important is Twitter for Germany?
So Twitter has a relatively small market share, and one of the challenges we have as researchers is that we have only Twitter data, mostly Twitter data, to work with. As I mentioned earlier, and I expect you know, Facebook does not share. I once said that Facebook doesn't collaborate well with academics to a Facebook manager, and he said, "We collaborate, we hire academics all the time." So they have immense amounts of data that could probably tell us how much fake news is being shared in Germany. We know they have the data scientists to do that analysis. For now, the best proxy is for those of us on the outside to work with Twitter data.
Thank you. Here's a question, eine Frage.
My name is Reinhard Fröhlich. I'm working at the local Chamber of Commerce. And I do the Twitter account for my chamber. The question follows up on the last one. What is your expectation for Germany when it comes to election time? What will be the picture about bad bots and so on? The second question is, are you doing the same research for Russia? If you look at Twitter in Russia, which bad bots would we see? Chinese, German, Israeli, American?
Could you answer this shortly?
Shortly, yes. So my expectation, I'll do the English answer. My expectation that the level of bot activity was relatively low. I would expect it to go up. I don't expect it to reach American levels. And the same with Facebook. And the same with fake news. I expect that it will rise. I don't expect it'll hit the levels that we saw in the United States. We are not studying Russia. This is a good question because we probably could, but I also believe that the communication strategy that Russia has used in several countries has been successfully exported. This strategy of planting multiple contradictory stories at the same time, including the truth, is a particular propaganda strategy of the Russians, and that has been successfully ported over into other countries. Whether or not it's run by Russians or not, I don't know. But that strategy has now successfully been exported. Russia has its own platform, F-Kontakte. They don't use Facebook as much, and it has been built from the ground up as a mechanism for surveillance. So I could study it, but I'm not. I already feel comfortable about guessing at what I'd find there.
Die letzte Frage, bitte.
My name is Roger Yeager, I'm a journalist. Just one question. Couldn't help wondering Brexit and the Trump campaign were both supported by a company called Cambridge Analytics. Could you comment on their role?
So Cambridge Analytics is, yes, one of the companies at the center, supposedly, of the successful communication strategy. I think they had a role in purchasing large amounts of data that helped the campaign, the Trump campaign, and the Leave campaign figure out which buttons to push. I do think their role was secondary to the embedded staff. Facebook had somebody assigned to the Clinton campaign, and they had somebody assigned to the Trump campaign. And so they were employees of the company, but they were working for those two as clients. And my understanding is that Trump made more use of his Facebook consultant. He basically let the consultant do the social media strategy. And I think that may have been a more important reason for Trump's success.
Thank you very much. A big applause again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I suggest that we postpone the Q&A session to the coffee break, and you will be around for that. Thank you very much, and also for your strong plea to take action.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.